Hey everyone. Today we are going to start diving into the nitrogen cycle. And this is a little science heavy, a little more so than I know everybody wants to jump right into the animal husbandry. When we're talking about animals that live in an aqueous environment, the nitrogen cycle and understanding the properties of water itself is the most important part in dealing with the husbandry for these animals. Again, we're looking at a group here where you've learned in your other husbandry courses if you have an injury, how to wrap a bandage, how to apply, either give medication or injections, ways you can hide medicine and food, things like that. Totally different ballgame here when we're dealing with animals that live in an aqueous system. Uh, we have to treat the environment, not the animal. If your fish or sea urchin has an injury, you are not going to pick them up and put a band-aid on them and give them a kiss and hope they feel better. Please do not do that. That's not the way to treat these animals. We are looking at, and it's tough. I'll be honest with you. It's tough as a keeper too, to see an animal that's either stressed, injured, sick, perhaps, um, and know that really the best thing for them is to tackle it from a hands-off approach where you're treating the environment, and very rarely are we actually treating the animal itself. One of the key things on this opening slide for the nitrogen cycle is something to keep in mind for all aqueous systems. With mammals, for example, we're always trying to mimic their natural habitat, provide enrichment, things like that. And we still are doing that for animals in aquaria. But really what we're looking for is minimizing stressors, which is a kind of a different approach to keeping animals in captivity. Because there's always going to be glass walls, we are never going to mimic their environment perfectly. Things will somehow be unnatural. We have guests that want to tap on the glass as well, things like that. We're really looking to minimize stress. And a huge part of minimizing that stress is, again, treating the environment as best we can. So whereas we're adding maybe natural looking trees or enrichment items or play structures to a mammal habitat. Here, in order to create the best environment, we're treating the water. That's the environment. Yes, of course, the furniture and hiding places and stuff that makes it decorative, that's all important. But here we're really looking at treating the water itself, and that's what's going to drive proper husbandry in aquaria. To put into perspective, let's look at what happens when water quality is subpar. It's a whole list of things. I don't need to go through every one of them. But one of the things to note here is the big one at the bottom, death. Not a good one, not something we're shooting for. The overlying theme here, of course, is the fact that almost every issue you see that could come up with your aqueous animals, and again, fish are easy to use as just a base model, but this is true for every animal you'll have, whether it's invertebrate, vertebrate, fish, shark, skate, ray, you name it. Almost every symptom you would see is a result of poor water quality. The only thing that's not on here is really age-related issues, which of course you're not going to be able to manage that no matter what the water quality is. But almost everything else, from either abnormalities in behavior, abnormalities in health quality. One of the big ones is right here in the middle, reduced growth rate. If your animals aren't, and it ties in with poor food conversion, if your animals aren't growing properly, aren't eating properly, outside of a crazy health issue that you couldn't manage in the first place, if there's something truly wrong with your animal to begin with, outside of that, it's always going to come back and circle back to water quality parameters. Death obviously being the big no-no here that we want to steer clear of, but almost all of this, like I said, is tied to how you are treating the water and managing the levels of various qualities of that aqueous environment. So right here, I will just caution everybody. This is one of those both lectures and slides right here where, aside from maybe specific gravity, I bet I could ask the entire class, hey, who knows all this? And everybody would raise their hands. Things like pH, or certainly dissolved oxygen you could figure, probably salinity. Water hardness is another one, like pH. maybe alkalinity, where people feel familiar with them, but they're really not. This is a very humbling field, just as zookeeping in general, and it's always going to challenge you with the, like, picture a type of scenario where, hey, does everybody know what pH is? The whole class raised their hands. Okay, I'll give you an A in the class and you can be done completely if you can define pH for me right now. And then slowly but surely, all the hands go down. It's one of those that everybody's familiar with because you've heard it enough, but probably not something that you could truly define. Even what pH stands for usually gets all the hands in the class down, and that's okay. But for you, for your college experience, just go into it with that humbleness of, yeah, I'm familiar with it. That's good, but I don't know it completely. I need to learn more. I'll dive in and start studying what it truly means, how to apply it, and then more importantly, which we'll talk about in a couple slides here, what do we do about it? And again, this isn't a knock on any of the local pet stores, but let's say you were to walk into a local pet store, and I've seen it happen. You walk in, they do the free water testing, and somebody hands them their water. They say, "Oh, all your fish are dying because your pH is off." And customer says, "Oh, yeah, pH, yep, sure, it sure is off. I'll get some new pH in there." And then they walk out of the store, and possibly the employee, but definitely the customer, still has no idea what happened. You know your pH is off, or let's say you've got hard water, and it's one of those like, "Yep, I'll get softer water next time." And that's not how it works. You can't do that at an aquarium. And again, this is a difficult class to teach because not knowing what facility you wind up at, you may not wind up at, let's, for here in Colorado, let's take Downtown Aquarium, for example. That's a fantastic facility. They have a lot of machines, however, that are treating the water and doing all the readings for this. More than likely a doser that does adjust these volumes. But you could also be working somewhere like Cheyenne Mountain Zoo's old aquatic building, where you do have true like fish tanks. You don't have giant computers hooked up to these enormous circulation systems and filtration systems. And so whether or not you're actually treating the environment or just recognizing the signs, it still makes it important to understand what each of these terms mean. So the first thing we're going to talk about are trace elements. Sometimes you'll hear these described as dissolved solids as well. They're present in every body of water, whether the stuff that comes out of your tap, whether stuff that you created and made and treated and added to or taken away from, saltwater or freshwater. It's going to be present everywhere. It is a natural occurring, phenomena that happens with any body of water, and then the organisms that we introduce to these environments are going to either take these things on naturally, and usually it should be a very natural process, and occasionally there could be an abundance of one or more trace elements, and then we can start running into problems. The naturally occurring trace elements, assuming we haven't either used improper water or possibly put in too much additives, should create a natural both growth and maturation cycle for these animals. The way an animal functions is going to be predicated on these trace elements being present. And again, for the most part, these elements are going to be present in any water you use. Again, Colorado's another weird one. As you get closer to the coast, sometimes these elements get thrown out of whack. But as a general rule, you're going to find pretty much the base elements in every body of water. It's just what it's going to reflect in the animal. That's where we start getting concerned, is how it's going to affect the animal. So if you've been to your local pet stores, you've probably seen stuff like this. And again, depending on your take, maybe these are relevant. I personally recommend staying away from a lot of the additives, unless you're a chemist and you're really going to get into water quality. A lot of the additives can be misused improperly. It's more looking at assuming that you're using water out of the tap or a local source. Much more important to look at the source itself and then make your judgment from there. We'll talk about consistency and why that's important a little later. But really, water changes is the not the only, but pretty much the only way to treat this. However, if you start to understand your water chemistry and you're getting a consistent result out of your tap, then you can really start looking at the additives as a way to combat or change what happens as far as the water chemistry of the tank. But you're not looking at the tank. You need to be looking at your water source. Then you can change it. If you know what water is coming out of your tap, for example, then every week or 2 weeks that you're doing this water change, then you're really going to be able to treat and mitigate any factors that might be affecting your animals. Again, the problem until you understand the chemistry of it could be overloading. And then Colorado makes things challenging as well. Does anybody have experience with maybe the challenges Colorado brings up or just how to combat trace elements and topping off and all the things we have to do here because water evaporates so quickly?
Yes, my tank evaporates so quickly that I want to pour more and more water into it, but I know that that's not what you should do.
Yeah, one of the hardest things, like when I got into fish keeping, was figuring out this balance between when to just do a water change at that point, and how often I need to versus when I can top off. And it really is like learning the chemistry of what you're getting out of your tap water, or even like if you're using RO water, like the reverse osmosis. If you're using tap water, whether you're going to leave it out for 24 hours or you're going to, add something like a chlorine eliminator, and just making sure you don't add too much and like testing the tap water so you know what you're actually putting in your tank. Because if it is easier to do, suck out the extra gallon and just consider yourself doing a full water change at that point rather than trying to start adding crazy stuff to a top off, if that's what you want to call it, because a lot of people feel that they can't just like throw water in their tank, and you'll hear a lot of people tell you to add those elements or to make sure that the water's good. And a lot of people just start playing chemist, and like a big thing is salt doesn't evaporate. So if you have a saltwater tank, not adding salt to your top off water. But I've been in fish stores that they're like, oh, make sure you treat your water before you top it off, and people are going to automatically assume like, oh, well, I need to add salt to that then, or I need to add, all they have 7 steps sitting on the shelf, so I must need to add all 7 steps to this. And it's really just test your water that you're adding for a top off, test it before you add it for anything, and understand what you're actually putting in your tank.
Those are excellent points. And I think one of the big things that was touched on is that it got repeated again and again, which is perfect. Adding. You might think you're topping off your tank, but you're adding all of these dissolved trace elements, and it compounds. And I heard correctly, the things like salt don't evaporate. And so just to put into perspective, for our saltwater tank that we manage in the classroom, it has an auto top off, so it does keep the water levels appropriate. But we're topping it off with fresh water. We're not adding salt water to the tank to top it off because, as it was said, salt's not going to evaporate, just like these trace elements. We add fresh water to the tank, knowing the full time that all the salt content is still there and still mixed in. So it's the same thing with trace elements. As you do these top offs, yes, you're adding water, but you're also adding and compounding the effect that all these trace elements will have on the animal. And so water changes is really the way to go. I also heard something else about the testing, and that really is a part of it. And this is, again, not a knock if you have a fish tank at home and you have the little dip strips. Cool, that's doing something. But most of the dip strips test only ammonia levels and really nothing else. There's a lot more going on with the chemistry of your water. And so if you're gonna buy the 14 steps to a proper aquaria at the pet store, make sure you understand and can test for all of these various elements. You can't just assume that you need to add everything. It's more than likely present in your water already. Things like strontium chloride and calcium and carbonate are 2 of the most prominent things. This is especially important if you're running a reef tank, i.e. in salt water, but it's important in every tank. Calcium and carbonate, I'm going to do my super famous drawings on here. Calcium and carbonate combined create calcium carbonate as a unique element, CaCO3. This is arguably the most, not dominant, but at least prevalent structure in an aqueous environment. Obviously used for anything that calcium would go to, skeleton, skeletal structure, rigidity. Again, we're looking at animals like sponges or coral, perhaps, that don't truly have tissue, but they're going to use calcium carbonate to reinforce or create the structure which they sit upon. Strontium chloride, again, important for skeletal growth. So important, and again, I know it sounds weird to say, because we're talking about some animals that don't even have true tissue being in that environment, and a lot of invertebrates. So skeletal growth, yes, but rigidity or support, possibly even external skeletons. So don't think of it as just bone growth. It's rigidity and the ability to hold up in that aqueous environment. Also, strange side note, strontium chloride is also used. It's what makes red, the color red, in fireworks. That's definitely not a test question, but something fun and cool that you can dazzle your friends with on the 4th of July. Salinity, this one's probably the easiest of the gang to understand and process. It's the saltiness or dissolved salt content in a body of water. We measure this, and you'll see these pop up both in your reading and research in aquaria keeping guides all the time. PPT or ppm, that's parts per thousand or parts per million. This is how, again, relative to how you're studying and what you're looking at, this is the measurement or the reading of the salinity of that environment. It is very easily measurable, again, based off how big of an environment you're going to treat. And one of the key things that we've mentioned before, just to keep in the back of your mind, as we start talking all this water chemistry stuff, it seems like you want a smaller, easier to manage environment. That's not the case. The larger the environment, the easier it gets to actually treat and manage. And the reason for that is, I always use this analogy of having a little saucer with water, and then you take a drop of green food coloring and drop that in, the entire saucer is going to turn green. But if I drop a drop of food coloring in a lake, for example, you're not going to notice that food coloring at all. The more we shrink down and condense the environment, the bigger effect any kind of change has. And salinity is the same way. Salinity is much easier to manage in a huge saltwater tank versus a very small, let's say like a 20-gallon tank. Any change in salinity in a 20-gallon tank is going to be drastic, whereas a slight change in salinity in a 1,000-gallon tank, you're probably not even going to see it show up on the radar. So something to keep in mind for that. Again, as was mentioned earlier, with the top-offs and things like that, that's really a time to be conscious of what you're doing. When you're compounding trace elements in a very, very small environment, it adds up quickly. If you have a 125-gallon tank, it's a lot different than a small 20-gallon tank as far as top-offs. Still wouldn't recommend them as the go-to maintenance strategy. Water changes are still going to be relevant, but you have more wiggle room in a 100-gallon tank versus a 20-gallon tank. When we're talking just salinity, couple tools at your disposal. It's worth it, from my experience, to pick up the real deal, little more expensive versions. They are significantly more accurate. And something that always trips people up is the salt content of even fresh water. I think so often we hear, oh, that's a saltwater tank. It must have a lot of salt in it. And yes, it does. But freshwater salinity is 1.0 or less. So it's not like freshwater is devoid of salt content. It's the reason, and we're not going to get into it today because it's a chemistry lesson for another time. Salt content makes people very confused, I feel, because we all grew up thinking of electrolytes as this magical thing that Gatorade and other drinks possess. It's salt. It helps our body retain water. It's treated differently, and again, we'll talk about that another day. But it's weird that people think that you can't drink ocean water, which you can't, but Gatorade has electrolytes. And it's this weird dynamic of, yeah, Gatorade just has a lot of salt in it. It's a different treated salt that does help us retain water, but salt content on its own isn't enough to mitigate dehydration and things like that. There's salt in your fresh water. You cannot drink ocean water, but you can drink Gatorade. So still, again, one of these things where everybody understands salinity, but if I ask why you can drink Gatorade and not ocean water, all the hands again in class kind of go down. So one of those where we still have to pay attention and be aware. And one of the best ways to monitor this whole process is through a refractometer. As I mentioned, personally, in my experience, it's worth it to invest in a pricier one. And again, if you're working at a huge facility, you're never going to go out and use a refractometer on your aquarium. There's a huge computer that's every 15 minutes updating what stage of salinity you're at, if you need to add, subtract, do a water change, things like that. Yeah, there may never be the issue pop up where you need to use this. If you are working, however, at a place with jewel box exhibits or smaller individual enclosures that aren't linked up to a filtration system, then this becomes your bread and butter of how you're making sure your animals are taken care of every day. With salinity, just like the dissolved trace elements that we were talking about, as water evaporates, and this is like something cool you can try at home, as the water evaporates, which again in Colorado, it really evaporates. We lose about 5 to 7 gallons a day from our saltwater tank that we keep. The salt stays behind, which is why we top off with fresh water. However, if you've ever seen, or you personally keep a saltwater tank, you also know that sometimes the salt kind of crusts up around the edge and you'll see the actual dissolved, the undissolved salt now accumulate at the edges of your aquaria. Now all of a sudden, maybe you need to do a water change or possibly add more salt because some salt's made its way out of the tank, not through evaporation, but just through either sloshing. We have a bunch of filters and fans and pumps that run, so water's constantly moving higher than it should. And you'll start to get a buildup or accumulation of salt there. Then it's time for a water change, and then we will replace with salt water, whereas normally we're topping off with fresh water. Specific gravity, a term that probably is the least familiar to all of you, but relatively easy. This is basically the unit of measurement to identify salinity in water. It's measured again in ppt, or parts per thousand. I guess the closest analogy I have for you is for specific gravity. It's how we measure salinity. So it's kind of like using a tape measure and then saying the inches out loud. Like you could say the measurement is 60 something. The inches part is what the specific gravity is, if that makes sense. So the specific gravity of this tank is blank, and that's the salinity, just like the length of this is 60 inches, and the inches are defining what we're really measuring. So it's the unit of measurement in which salinity is actually calculated. Alkalinity, this one's tricky, and this one trips a lot of people up. As far as the actual science of it, the net charge of all negatively charged ions that could bind with hydrogen plus ions. You're probably sitting there saying, what? I thought I was taking zoo classes, not chem classes. Yes and no. Alkalinity, though, again, is just one of these things that I can't stress enough. I've taught this for long enough now that the whole class raises their hands and go, oh, I know what alkaline water is. Okay, define it. And then again, all the hands go down. It's tricky. The science behind it is difficult to put into words, I guess. And while I do want you to understand what alkalinity is, an equally important part is what to do about it. Again, using the analogy of going into the pet store and getting your water treated or tested, they come back and give you the results. That's great if you understand you have acidic water, perhaps. It's what you do about it. That's the part that's important. How do we treat this? How do we manage it? How do we get it back to a safe or appropriate level? Or do we even need to? Um, Obviously, if you're getting your water tested, more than likely something's gone horribly wrong. There's probably health issues, possible deaths with your fish, and you're trying to correct that. Um, and sometimes your tank could be on one end or the other, and maybe your animals are fine. This is what we look at as far as alkalinity translations. Again, there's a myriad of tests out there at your disposal. And again, from hobby side to anything that doesn't use a computer to monitor daily, there's going to be tests available for you for this. We're looking at acidic or optimal, or what we consider optimal is really neutral, is what we look at. Alkaline, acidic, neutral being in the middle. And while 7 is neutral for most species, there's a weird discretion between trying to create a perfectly optimal environment and doing too much to a tank. Of course, when you start going on different ends of the scale, anytime it says vary, that's probably too much of an extreme. But do we need to constantly be trying to get to optimal? Not necessarily. We want consistency, and you'll see that theme pop up again and again. But like I said earlier, the key to all of this is both understanding what, let's say you put your dip strip in and you read right here at maybe 5.0, not ideal. Just knowing that it's 5.0 isn't doing anything for you from a husbandry perspective. So we've got to come up with ways to alter that, both the acidity side, the closer we get to optimal, the better, but the acid side and the alkaline side, we need ways to treat that. That is where this comes into play, not just the readings. It's wonderful if you can do your dip strip and say, oh, my tank is too acidic. What am I going to do about it? That's kind of the next step of the journey. And there's ways out there. It's just familiarizing yourself with that process. So does anybody have ideas of ways that we can treat or mitigate acidic or alkaline environments?
So crazy, I guess, shrimp keeper, not really fish keeper story here. But when I first got into keeping shrimp, I joined a couple, like, as one does in today's world, joined a bunch of Facebook groups, and people started mentioning these Indian almond leaves. And at the time, shrimp keeping wasn't crazy popular, and I guess neither were these leaves. So a trip to eBay and like 3 months of waiting on this package from Lord knows where. It came with like crazy stamps on it from India, and there are some brown leaves in my mailbox. And actually, the whole thing is, you put them in your tank, and the tannins start to leach out of them, and they actually adjust the pH in the tank. So it's really common in shrimp keepers, especially now. I guess I could probably just go in Petco and buy them. But it really does, not only just the water turns brown and it looks cool, but it causes your pH to just adjust itself. And it really was the healthiest my tank has ever been, to just kind of monitor these leaves and monitor my pH level and change them as needed. But instead of adding all these crazy like outside sources and like trying to play with chemicals, I threw a dried leaf in my tank and it was good to go. And the shrimp loved it, and watching them like climb on it and kind of eat at it and pick at it, and just seeing the tank be that healthy was really rewarding. And it looked cool to have big giant leaves in the tank.
So to piggyback off of that, there's a few different ways on top of the Indian almond leaves. I think they're called catappa leaves. If you ever go in and you can't seem to locate a package that says Indian almond leaves, there are a few other ways that with natural products that you can probably find at the beach or at your local creek, or even in a pet store, that can also help lower the pH. I've heard of driftwood, but with that, if you use found driftwood, you want to make sure that you boil it a little bit in salt water, just to kill off anything that could bring in pathogens for your living beings inside of your tank. But also, you don't want to buy something that was maybe intended for a reptile enclosure because it might be treated with chemicals, and that's something else you don't want to introduce to your tank. And then another thing that I found was people will take chunks of peat moss or put some peat moss in a little mesh baggie and put it inside of their filter, and or you can pre-treat water this way and kind of filter out the color, but it will, I mean, these methods also will tend to turn your tank brown or yellow, but I mean, really that's what you see in the wild as well. But also they make these reverse osmosis or deionized water filtration systems to also kind of keep a handle on the pH level from it getting too high. Um, but yeah, also consider your needs before choosing, because reverse osmosis filtrations, reverse osmosis water tends to be a little bit more higher in pH, and the deionized water that's usually lower in pH but will raise, I believe it raises when it absorbs carbon dioxide from the air. Alex, maybe you can help me kind of decipher that. I believe or maybe, yeah, it raises, right?
Yeah, first off, a lot to touch on. Everything that was said, accurate. Yeah, geez, so many good points were brought up just now. One of the let's start at the beginning. The first one I heard was a lot of the times both, and again, the tip about driftwood. Driftwood's a very common kind of cure for a lot of the stuff, but again, if you're picking up stuff that's found, yeah, it's going to have a lot of pathogens on it. Needs to be cleaned properly. Somebody brought up the point about the driftwood made for reptile perching. Basically, that is not designed for an aquarium. Usually, it's covered both with something that makes it easier to wipe off and clean. So obviously, a chemical that you don't need. But the resounding thing that I heard from everyone was changing the color of the water. And this is very true. It's very relevant. And again, kind of makes the most ironic part about aquaria keeping. That brown color is exactly what you want. You want algae growing up the side of your tank. You want it to be brown. You want it to look lived in by not only the species that you're exhibiting, but by the tannins and the algae and the bacteria that would naturally exist in an aqueous environment. And this is the most like oxymoronic or ironic part of aquaria keeping. Every guest there wants your water crystal clear, and that's not how it works. So we need to come up with ways to combat that, where we still have a natural-ish environment. It just doesn't look that way, and that's really hard to do. Again, if you're a mammal keeper, you can put the big tree in or the natural rock outcropping, and oh, now it looks natural. But for all your fish and invertebrate species, you want your water crystal clear, and that's not what their natural environment looks like. So we need to create an environment where the water's being treated like it's natural, but the appearance is completely different. And again, that's one of the reasons that we're focusing on the nitrogen cycle and how to treat water. It's a counterintuitive way of husbandry, and that makes it very, very difficult to understand. The RO systems that were brought up are, I'm not going to say heavily used, but certainly once you get into the saltwater side of things, used quite a bit. We also use in our lab RO water for our amphibians, but not for our reptiles. RO does affect both pHs and a lot of the dissolved solids that usually are very beneficial for reptiles and such. One of the biggest reasons for RO, amongst the other treatment options, is it dechlorinates. And that's very relevant when keeping aquaria. Everything needs to be dechlorinated, but I've seen freshwater fish die if you use RO water. It's just not what they're used to. They need all the trace elements. They do still need dechlorinated water, but for freshwater species, chlorine will neutralize itself in about 24 hours. So if you have a freshwater tank at home, really you can fill up a bucket with fresh water, leave it out overnight, and it'll be good to use in the morning. So before we move on, does anybody have anything else
I do. I know you've mentioned this isn't really a chemistry class, but it sounds really chemical, but it's also we're working on a microbiological level, and it's so cool, and I really love this so much about this process. Um, so with the driftwood and the peat moss and even the catappa leaves, they all have like the other student said, the tannins, tannic and gallic acids, consume the biocarbonates in the water, which is what actually physically reduces the alkalinity in the water. So I just wanted to kind of get a little bit more in depth with that. I thought that was so cool.
That is awesome. Excellent. Such good examples being brought up. This is fantastic. Um, so yeah, I think overall, what I want you to take from this is, yes, you can get your reading very easily. What are you going to do about it? That's the reason we're learning all this stuff. And again, different parts of the country that you live in are going to affect this differently because you might have more dissolved trace elements. You might be topping off more. So much is at play here. But again, just getting the reading isn't doing much for us. Yes, we can find out what's wrong. How are we going to treat it? What are some things we can try and experiment with? And I'm certainly not advocating your tank to be a guinea pig test run with living organisms in it, but you have a little bit of wiggle room to try stuff out. And if you're taking regular monitoring and testing regularly, you can see if this is working or if it's not. And this isn't like, hey, go home and throw whatever you want in your tank and just hope for the best. But it is an environment where you can, I don't want to say play around because again, that kind of gives the wrong idea, but you can experiment with things and things don't always work out perfectly. You might have a different filtration system than the item that you added or took out was recommended for. There's tons of elements and variables at play, but understanding ways that you can reduce or minimize the stressors again, that's the importance here. Is figuring out ways that you can make your environment as natural as possible, and again, without it looking natural at all. Lots of weird conundrums here with aquaria keeping. pH is another one that trips people up quite a bit. This is the power of hydrogen, is what it is really related to. And it's the concentration of hydrogen ions as they relate to the water's ability to neutralize itself at any specific moment. This is that, again, I feel like the hobby pet side has almost done a disservice a little bit because, again, piece of cake to do your little dip strip. What am I looking at? It's like knowing the answer is 4, but not knowing what 2 plus 2 is, if that makes sense. You're not seeing the equation, you're just seeing the answer. And until you understand that, it makes aquaria keeping difficult. This is what we're looking at as far as a standard reading. Again, 7 almost across the board is going to be your neutral ideal environment for all species. If you have a well-established tank, I wouldn't say you need monitoring constantly, but certainly when you're starting up, adding fish or having die-offs occur. And again, this is talking about a much smaller scale aquarium, certainly not the million-gallon aquariums that you're talking about, like Atlanta Aquarium, things like that. But if you are responsible for basically a jewel box enclosure, a smaller aquaria, maybe with the back of the tank filter on it, then this really comes into play. There are various ways to measure, either handheld or benchtop meters. The key here with pH is consistency, I guess is what I want to say. Consistency is the most important part. There's a weird thing that occurs in the hobby industry, especially. We call it chasing the pH. It's where you're trying to maintain this, It's where you're trying to maintain this perfect 7, and you're constantly adding and subtracting, let's say driftwood or garlic or leaves, you name it. That's good if you want to actually correct something and get it back to a good place, but monitoring it every day and adding or subtracting these elements, that's going to be more stressful for your fish. Again, remember, in aquaria, our number one goal, minimize stressors on these animals. And so chasing the pH is much more at a detriment to your animals. If you're adding a big piece of driftwood to correct something and you're going to leave it in there no matter what, okay, I can live with that. But daily checking and adding or subtracting or taking out half a leaf, much more stressful for your animals than just allowing them to live. And this is, I guess now is a good point to talk about it real quick. This idea of chasing the pH or chasing the perfect anything in a tank, from dissolved solids to dissolved anything. I'm trying to word this correctly because I certainly don't want it to come off like, hey, if your fish are fine, they're fine. But that there is some truth in that. So many people that are responsible, again, I'm going to say, if you're a responsible pet owner or a fish owner, or you're taking care of them at a facility, of course you want to research their natural environment, but there's a distinct chance, and a very good chance actually, that these animals didn't come from their natural environment. They didn't come from an exotic lake in the Amazon. They came from Lake Petco, and they're going to be used to, let's say if you bought it in Colorado, they're probably going to be used to Colorado water. So if they're doing fine in Colorado water, just keep it consistent. If you live in, like, there's a big difference in water, whether it's depending on what company you use. But let's say you live in like the southeast part of Colorado, your water is going to be different than like metropolitan Denver. And so there is some chemistry there to figure out. But if your fish are thriving in their environment, try to keep it right there. Don't chase perfection when your fish are doing fine. If your fish are thriving in their environment, like, take a Polaroid picture, if you will, of the environment that they're thriving in. Just keep it there. Don't keep adding and subtracting to try to get it to somewhere that on the surface seems neutral or optimal when they're doing fine right here or right here. If they're doing great right here, keep it there. Keep it consistent. Using the same water source, whether that's an RO system right out of the tap that's dechlorinated. Any of these things are possible, but if your fish are thriving, you're doing something right. You can revisit the driftwood and the leaves if you start having complications or problems, but consistency is much more important than hitting this perfect spot right here. Consistency across the board. Again, I want you to, in your brains, tie in consistency with minimizing stressors. The adding and subtracting and changing everything to try to get it to perfect, that's much more stressful than just leaving it at an environment where the animal is thriving. Water hardness is another one where, again, the video link here will be provided when I post this link. It's a breakdown again of just the importance of consistency and where your fish are coming from. That's another really important part. The idea that we're trying to mimic a natural environment only goes to the aesthetics of the tank. As far as mimicking their natural aqueous environment, the water quality parameters, we're looking at what the animal does well in and what it thrives in. There's a good chance that if you pick, let's say, a cichlid from the Amazon, there's a very good chance that if you tried to mimic the water quality parameters of the Amazon itself and then dropped your cichlid from PetSmart in there, it's not going to do very well. That is a very huge, drastic change from what it's used to. So yes, we're researching natural environments, mostly talking about, though, furniture, exhibit design and construction, hiding places, things like that. If it's a schooling fish or if it's a solitary fish that likes to hide in a cave, then it's important. But water quality parameters, consistency across the board, that's what's important. And with all that out of the way, we now get into arguably the most important part, the nitrogen cycle. And I think the key to understand here is the word cycle. It is not a nitrogen process that goes in a straight line. It's not a linear equation. It is a up and down, ebb and flow, back and forth, true cycle that, and you guys hopefully understand, a cycle, if any part of it breaks down, the cycle resets itself. So it is always in movement, always in motion, and has to remain so in order to remain a cycle. The second we reset that cycle, everything goes haywire. And this is the most important part of understanding an aqueous system, the nitrogen cycle. Please enjoy this quick visual right here. This is as easy as it will ever get. It's about to get more complicated, but this is the gist of it. Something comes in, ammonia comes out, nitrite, nitrate, and then water changes. We're going to discuss this in two ways in this class. I'm going to tell you what we do in an aquarium and then how it would occur in nature. Both are important to understand, and it justifies the reason why we're doing these water changes. It all ties into the nitrogen cycle, and it's something that we really struggle to create in a artificial environment like a closed aquarium system. So we're going to look at it from both angles. So again, ebb and flow here with a rise and a fall and growth of and depletion of. It has to remain like this with constant movement, or the whole thing shuts down and starts over. As far as testing, which I know was mentioned earlier when we were asking about questions that were brought up, multiple test kits are involved here. And so often what the stores sell is an ammonia kit. That's good, but take a look at the graph here. You're only looking at one part of the entire nitrogen cycle. Much more important to get the 3-part test that can test for both nitrites and nitrates, pH involved as well. But if you're only looking right here, you're not getting anywhere close to the full picture that you need. We need to be testing here and here and getting a true image of what's going on. Ammonia being our starting point, all your testing is, like all you're seeing as a result of your testing is just how much waste is built up in your tank. That's relevant, but that's not a very good snapshot. If nothing's coming back like here to convert that waste into something else, you've got an even bigger problem. But just looking at it'd be like starting the alphabet with A and pretending you knew the whole thing. Until you get your way to Z, the alphabet doesn't mean a lot. You don't want to start with just A. This process itself is going to take time. We'll discuss that in a bit. But you need to be able to see every one of these ebbs and flows, if you will, throughout the process of cycling and starting up your tank. So the nitrogen cycle itself is, it hopefully isn't confusing for you this semester. It's a process that is made a little bit harder than it needs to be. It's the process of basically a harmful buildup of waste product that, if you think of it like nuclear waste, basically we're looking at like almost half-lives of when it gets converted into a less toxic compound. And in nature, we're going to look at 4 steps that go into it. We're taking a harmful compound and slowly but surely making our way to a less harmful compound. And that's going to involve using both the waste products initially and the bacteria that are going to rise and fall in order to combat said waste products. So our first step in this whole process, there's my man, Mr. Rogers, doing his thing. The initial step comes when waste is introduced to your tank. And that can happen in a myriad of ways, but this has to be the start of the nitrogen cycle. Aside from just Mr. Rogers here hanging out with his fish in an already established aquarium, and you know he kept good filtration, you know he's a good guy, his fish were well cared for. Don't ever question Mr. Rogers' water quality parameters. But aside from Mr. Rogers, what are some other ways we could introduce nitrogen, or this initial waste product, basically, to our tank?
So there are quite a few ways, actually. You can get, okay, so a lot of people will use goldfish because they kind of, they're very hardy with different environmental pH levels, or not that they can live in battery acid. Okay, so let me start over. Goldfish are really hardy and good example species. They will, as you feed them, they eat the food and they produce waste. And not only is the waste rich in ammonia and nitrates, but so is the food. So whatever food they're not eating is also going into that environment. Um, I've read where even introducing a hot dog into your tank will, because hot dogs are so full of nitrates that they just, you know, basically just dump the ammonia nitrate into the water, and that can kick off the start of the nitrogen cycle. But also just putting food into your tank and letting it kind of cycle through. With the filter going and everything, and as it breaks down, fish food does also contain a lot of nitrates in it, and the more nitrates that build up, the that's the kickstart to the nitrogen cycle, because then that's when the bacteria begin to grow, and the process goes from there. Or not the process, I'm sorry, the cycle goes from there.
Awesome. I'm super glad we had somebody mention hot dogs in there. As wonderful as hot dogs are, they are giant nitrogen sticks. It's a great way to start your nitrogen cycle, plus a good conversation starter when people come over and you have an empty tank with a hot dog floating in it. And you can pick and choose how you want to start that conversation. You can go into in-depth analysis of how the nitrogen cycle works, or you can act like a crazy person and pretend that's your first fish that you're introducing. I also heard another good example, but one that I hope I say with enough class and dignity that it doesn't sound weird. Honestly, one of the best ways to start up is hardy fish, basically your feeder fish or goldfish. And they are. I don't want to come off as I'm saying, hey, buy these kind of pass-offable fish to start your tank, but that is accurate. They're hardy, they can live in almost anything, and they will kickstart your nitrogen cycle. Goldfish are really gross. They're dirty. And it's not a knock on goldfish. They're cool. If you like the ones with the big cheeks, the bubble eyes, good for you. They're hardy fish, though, and they'll live in your tank. They overeat, they produce copious amounts of wastes, and they start getting nitrogen or ammonia, which is our first step, introduced into the tank. It's a very valid way to say, hey, these goldfish are thriving. They're going to start everything. But in the same breath, don't think because a goldfish is doing well in your tank that you can just buy anything now and add it. Goldfish are the hardy starters to the nitrogen cycle, but they are not the measuring stick of quality of life for other organisms that you might introduce to that tank. They are a great way to start, however. Ghost feeding is our other option, which was mentioned. It's just feeding your tank with nothing in there. And this is one of those other kind of counterintuitive weird things about fish keeping. The reason anybody's tank gets so dirty is from overfeeding. You can even read the backs of your fish food directions. You're supposed to feed whatever they'll feed in either 2 or 5 minutes, depending on the species, and then scoop the rest out with the net. Does anyone do that? Probably not. You feed your fish, you watch them eat, it's very fun, and then you walk away. Any food that's been masticated and spit out, any food that just sinks to the bottom, that all becomes a waste product. That, for the sake of what we're talking about, is a good thing because that's the start of our nitrogen cycle. But that's usually why your tanks are getting dirty. It's from overfeeding and just unprocessed food falling to the bottom, getting stuck in the substrate, and then giving off nitrogen. That's the reason you're going to do water changes, and that's the reason your tank might smell, things like that. But in this case, it's also the way that we're kickstarting the nitrogen cycle. The first process here is the most important, obviously, because that's what gets everything set into motion. But as was mentioned earlier, it is a cycle. It's not just a linear walkthrough. We need this constant rise of ammonia. We need something to combat that. We need something to combat that. It's like the Avengers movies, if you like those. We always need a bad guy. We always need heroes rising. But if all the bad guys are just done, we wouldn't have any more Marvel movies. We always need the rise of something to fight it. And still in the background, if you will, there's always another bad guy, in this case, nitrogen, rising to the occasion. There's always going to be something for these superhero bacteria to go out there and fight. So Our first step, again, I know a lot of you will probably reference back to the cute picture we had of the fish and like 3 steps to get to the end. Now we're going to get into it. The initial process of this initial spike, and you guys remember the ebb and flow graph where things rise and fall. Ammonia is our most toxic compound. As we introduce either these goldfish here, as we ghost feed, or as we add the hot dog, here's what happens. We have an ammonia level rise. Ammonia of the nitrogenous compounds is the most toxic. It's dangerous at very low levels. Ammonia is the worst thing for our tank. And of course, it's what fish, excess food, and our hot dog naturally put out. And just as a PSA, we had Costco hot dogs a couple days ago. This is not an anti-hot dog campaign, but there is a lot of nitrogen there. And with nitrogen comes ammonia, and in our aqueous environment, it is our most toxic compound. So we're going to need a Avenger or a superhero to rise to the occasion to combat ammonia. So our first step is introducing ammonia. Now comes our first superhero. And I hope you guys refer to these bacteria as superheroes now. That's a fantastic analogy, I feel. I feel good about it. I like talking about heroic bacteria here. Our first contender is the Nitrosomonas bacteria. And Nitrosomonas are going to grow on any surface available to them. This is why there's so many unique ways to administer filtration in an aqueous environment. Filtration is yes, to filter the water, but it's so much more than that. It's a site for bacterial growth. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. Even if you buy the pet store version with the back of the tank filter, yes, it's filtering, it's oxygenating, it's doing some work, but it's also providing an environment for bacteria to grow. And again, I know I've said it already, it sounds counterintuitive because we want a crystal clean tank, but we also need all this bacteria and we need surfaces for it to grow on. This all comes down to basically a surface area versus volume equation. We need surfaces for this bacteria to sit so that it's not on the glass walls of the tank. So even things like substrate, things like aquarium plants or decorations. And then once you get into the kind of higher levels of aquaria keeping in the filtration system. That's why we have things like both filter floss, ceramic noodles, things like that. Areas that water passes through that are just huge, again, surface area to volume ratio surfaces on which this bacteria can grow. So in short, step 2, as we get this rise of ammonia, here's our ammonia spike. We'll use green for Nitrosomonas bacteria. This bacteria, after this has reached, let's say this is critical levels, you'll have the kickoff if you have the surface area for them to grow. This bacteria grow to consume all this ammonia. As it grows and consumes the ammonia, and again, guys, this is like, should be pretty common sense. As it grows and consumes, the ammonia dips down. As the ammonia dies off, there's not enough food for this bacteria. Think of it just like an ecosystem, because that's really what the nitrogen cycle is. As ammonia falls, this will fall because there's not enough food. If we want to think of Nitrosomonas as an apex predator, as the prey count rises, which is ammonia, more and more predators show up. They consume to a point where the numbers start to dip off, and in turn, Nitrosomonas will dip down as well. So you can already see the start of this ebb and flow, the cycle, not just a linear process here. You can already see the start of this cycle with nitrogen breakdown. So the way we talk about it in science-wise, it converts ammonia into nitrites. It's our first conversion. Really, it's the waste product of the process of consuming ammonia. So again, kind of not to put it in a bad light, you're eating ammonia and defecating out nitrites. That's basically the process here. Bacteria is consuming one nitrogenous compound, and the byproduct of that consumption is a less toxic compound known as nitrites. This whole process here is known as ammonification. As far as remembering that for a test. Remember, ammonia is our first compound introduced. Ammonification is the first process used to convert ammonia into nitrites. And again, this is all done by Nitrosomonas bacteria. So there's a graph, almost as good as I drew it. But you can see as the numbers go up, the bacteria goes up. And as it kind of overachieves, the number starts to dip off. This will die down as well. It's a very give and take. As far as nitrite, it is less toxic than ammonia, yes. But we're not to the finish line yet. We're still dealing with a dangerous compound left in the aquarium. As far as, hopefully you never get to this point, but as far as what would indicate some high nitrite levels, usually we see fish almost look like they're trying to breathe air, as if they had lungs. They'll sit at the surface and look like they're either trying to eat or gasp for air. It's the appearance of lack of oxygen, but more than likely it's your nitrite levels. Here we have just a comparison, if you will, because I don't want to make it sound like nitrites is the finish line. It's still a very dangerous compound, but to put into comparison to ammonia, nitrites can be tolerated about twice the level ammonia can. So ammonia is the worst. Nitrite's still not good, but the animals can tolerate that for longer and tolerate about twice as much in their environment as they could ammonia to begin with. So our next superhero to rise to the occasion. Here we have Nitrobacter. And as far as studying, you can write either Nitrobacter or Nitrobacter bacteria. Nitrobacter indicates that it's already a bacteria because we've got this segment of words right here. So either answer is very acceptable, and you can use them interchangeably. Whatever helps you study and remember the best. Nitrobacter will rise, and this is step 3 of the nitrogen cycle. So here we've got ammonia. Let me get all these arrows off of here. We've got ammonia right here. We've got nitrites right here. So this is not only let's look at it in 2 ways. Not only do we have the rise and fall of Nitrosomonas bacteria, but with that, the nitrites they produce. So ammonia is consumed, nitrites are given off, and then to consume those nitrites, we have Nitrobacter. As Nitrobacter steps in, we have the consumption of nitrites and the conversion into nitrates. In this process, known as nitrification, we're going to have the exact same thing happening here as far as this rise and fall. However, this is where we kind of step off the train in captivity. The consumption of all these toxic compounds and eventual conversion into nitrates, which is our least toxic compound, this is kind of the end of the line for us as keepers of aquaria. So again, hopefully you see it. I know it's a big process. A lot of the words sound similar. Nitrobacter, Nitrosomonas, nitrites, nitrates, nitrification, ammonification. But start familiarizing yourself with this and go back through and make sure you understand the ebb and flow and rise and fall of both bacteria and their byproduct as it transitions to a less toxic compound throughout this whole process. Quick review for all of it. Something's introduced. Again, hot dog, feeder fish, ghost feeding, something hardy, you name it. Nitrogen's introduced and ammonia is introduced. From there, as ammonia levels rise, so do Nitrosomonas to combat that. They consume ammonia, they produce nitrites in a process known as ammonification. Again, rise and fall, ebb and flow. As the nitrite level rises, then Nitrobacter comes along, converts nitrite to nitrates in a process known as nitrification. Again, quick review, but hopefully now that we've kind of gone over it in depth, this is all making sense to you. Again, the only hard part about it, once you get this concept down, is just remembering which one's a nitrite, a nitrate, and the process that occurs. So when we get to this kind of final stage, we get to nitrates, which are the least toxic compound. Again, not tolerable, but compared to ammonia, very tolerable as far as the environment itself. We still have to do something at this end step, which makes aquaria keeping, again, a challenge here. But nitrates is where we want to get to. And if we use this as a perfect diagram, I showed you earlier, but I'll show you right here again. If you have that test kit and you're only testing here, now you see the problem with not knowing where the end result sits. If we can't test our nitrate levels, just testing this is not a good thing. That just tells us how toxic our tank is. If I know that I've got a ton of nitrates as well, or a ton of nitrites, I know that each bacteria is kind of stepping up and tackling each of these nemesis in their own regard, and that the cycle is working. But again, like I said, kind of like the alphabet, it's like learning the letter A. Until I get to Z, the alphabet hasn't made a clear picture yet, if that makes sense. So nitrate is our end result. It's what we're shooting for. That means we've got enough bacteria growth to combat everything that came before it. And you'll see again, if you're testing, one of the things you might be missing is maybe surface area, like I said. If you've got ammonia and nitrites, but you're not really getting reading on nitrates, it means you don't have enough surface area for enough bacteria to grow. Maybe you only have enough here for nitrobacter, or excuse me, nitrosomonas, or nitrobacter here. And maybe then we add either stuff to the filter, maybe we add more substrate, maybe we add more decorations, plants, caves, rocky outgrowths, things like that. We need a surface area for all this bacteria to do its work. And we also need water to be passing through that. We need water to move by it. So we need some circulation involved as well. So this is where something tricky comes up. Because like I said, nitrates is basically the end of the line for us in captivity. And the fourth step, and this is how it'll appear on your exams as well, the fourth step to the nitrogen cycle is as it would occur in nature. And we need an anaerobic environment, or an area without oxygen. That's difficult for a myriad of ways. There's reasons behind why this is difficult to maintain and achieve, especially on the hobbyist side. In nature, however, I'll explain that and then we'll get to the challenges that it presents itself in captivity. In nature, you got to picture, let's just picture a babbling brook, a nice flowing stream, if you will. We've got this really oxygenated water. We've got tons of surface area for bacteria growth, right? Again, let's just picture a Bob Ross happy little stream here. This water is moving, constantly being churned. Bubbles are incorporated. We're getting dissolved oxygen involved in the picture. And tons of sites for bacteria. As this water flows, however, what's underneath all of this ecosystem? It's a bunch of substrate, right? We've got layers upon layers of saturated with water substrate, but eventually the dissolved oxygen runs out. Water still flows through there very slowly, but again, we're looking at a natural environment. As water flow slows down and gets saturated in the mud or the silt, if you will, we come to an anaerobic environment eventually, an area where all the oxygen has basically left the water. It's still flowing through, but because nature's awesome and it's been doing this for a long time, so I'm pretty sure it works. This anaerobic environment is going to grow bacteria of its own, and this bacteria is going to grow in anaerobic, meaning devoid of oxygen, conditions. And again, we're looking at the fourth step in nature. This is how nature runs the nitrogen cycle, and this is why it works. Anaerobic bacteria here is going to convert nitrates, which in a captive closed system is kind of our last step. It's going to convert nitrates into nitrogen gas. This is the real last step of the nitrogen cycle. If we're looking at the nitrogen cycle as it exists in nature, this is it. It's perfection. It's a great model, well designed, but it does pose some problems in captivity. Why would, and it's not impossible, but it's difficult, especially on the hobby side or the smaller end of things. Why would an anaerobic condition be difficult to recreate or mimic in captivity?
I feel like it's a lot because it's a lot to do with the oxygen in the water and the substrate and just everything kind of going into it. You have to have a very specific setup. I know anaerobic bacteria grows in substrate such as sand, even living rock, and it cannot have access to oxygen at all, or else it won't be able to colonize. Also, they really thrive in a pH level of 7. I think I read somewhere, and I know that this is like creating anaerobic bacteria colonies is really big in saltwater aquaria hobbyists, but in freshwater it can be done, but it's looked at as kind of a negative, like you don't want it, but it's actually really beneficial because it helps kind of maintain it. It really contributes, I should say, to the health of your environment, um, by because it converts the nitrates to the nitrites and then the nitrogen gas. It's got that denitrification process, where it kind of clings to the oxygen. And that's why you don't want them to have that access to oxygen. So you would need, like in this picture, I feel like is a really good example how it's got the sand. You would probably want anywhere from about 1.5 to 2 inches to further, so that they can have a place to live if you don't have living rock, but then also have some kind of vegetation to take on that oxygen. Um, that way it's kind of a barrier between, or almost like a natural filter. Correct me if I'm wrong, Alex. But I feel like the vegetation really does act like a kind of a barrier against the oxygenated water. That way the anaerobic bacteria can take its oxygen from those nitrates that it's developing from the nitrates that it consumes.
Awesome and spot on. I'm so glad plants got brought up. Living plants are a little bit challenging for people a lot of times. And again, this is not a knock if you have a fish tank at home and you have the neon plants from the pet store. I get it. That's cool decor. But all that's going to grow on it is bacteria, which can help with the first couple steps. Live plants help at every step of the nitrogen cycle. And again, another live plant that people don't give enough credit to, algae and bacteria. And you don't want to see that on the side of your tank. This point that was brought up, spot on with sand. Sand is an excellent way to create an anaerobic environment. And again, here's the challenge, and especially with freshwater or smaller tanks in general, but freshwater too. You got to picture, let me get this off of here. You got to picture this tank right here is filled with very highly saturated in oxygen, because let's say this is a 1,000,000-gallon aquarium instead of just this little snapshot here. Tons of organisms in here. We want a ton of dissolved oxygen, so we're basically ensuring that this oxygen is loaded and saturated with dissolved oxygen. If any of you guys have ever been to an aquarium and walked through the tunnel or the tube where you go inside of an aquarium, imagine now that whole tube is covered by sand, because we want all this dissolved oxygen to leach itself out as it goes through the substrate and get to an anaerobic environment. You're not going to build an enclosure like that. Nobody wants to walk through the sand tunnel at the aquarium. You want to walk through and have animals swimming on top of you. I realize it's how the nitrogen cycle works, but you're not going to be able to sell that to your boss of, hey, I want the nitrogen cycle good, so let's dump another 12 feet of substrate in here, cover up the tunnel, and then we won't really have to do water changes. And yes, that's accurate, but it's not something we're going to try to mimic on exhibit. We can do it off exhibit as water filters out. And again, sand is one of the best and primary tools utilized to create this anaerobic environment. But we're going to pump that water off exhibit, send it through a ton of sand. Eventually it'll hit an anaerobic environment. It'll turn those nitrates into nitrogen gas, and then we pump it back into the aquarium. Again, we're doing this off-site. So doing it on exhibit is difficult, because you need X amount or X inches or feet of anaerobic conditions and water pumping through it. So much easier to do off-site. For us, typically, however, in captivity or a closed system, as we call it, we're going to just wind up doing water changes. So one of the key things here is if we can create this environment, and again, I think Live rock and things were brought up as a great example, and they are. Typically, live rock becomes very cumbersome, or an abundance of it in a tank can kind of muddle up the aesthetics. That's why we have things like sumps, which we talked about in filtration. Something basically off exhibit where we can create this environment. We just want you got to picture every tank as two parts, right? What you're seeing versus the behind the scenes. Just like a Broadway play, you know what you're seeing on stage, but you know there's 50 people behind that, behind the curtain, working on new sets, making sure everything's clean and picked up and put away and everything's where it needs to be. That's like our filtration system versus the tank. So none of these are impossible to do in captivity, just really hard to do on display. A lot of this stuff happens behind the scenes. If we can accomplish denitrification, and we can get water flowing that's now deoxygenated through an anaerobic environment where bacteria has enough room to grow, then we can really reduce how often we have to change the water. We've basically completed the nitrogen cycle. Now the only reason for water changes would be evaporation and replacing dissolved trace elements, things like that. Other than that, you've almost mastered the entire process here. But the one little key caveat here is, and this is the most important part, actually it's all super important, remember all of it. The final byproduct is nitrogen gas, again in denitrification. So we've taken ammonia, gone to nitrites, gone to nitrates, and these are not I'm just writing this, these aren't like the chemical signs for this. Ammonia to nitrites to nitrates, and then we get to nitrogen gas. If we have that, I want you to picture that ebb and flow we've looked at. We have ammonia rise, we have nitrosomonas rise, we have nitrobacter rise, and as all these things rise and everything dips behind it respectively, let me try to get my colored pencils out the right way. Again, we have this ebb and flow, right? So we have the rise and fall of ammonia, we have the rise and fall of nitrites, and then we have, because of the anaerobic conditions, the rise and fall of nitrates. So here comes, we'll do anaerobic right here. If we have, and again, if we have a fully aqueous system here, and we convert all of these toxic compounds at the end of the line into nitrogen gas, what's gas going to do? Leave. It's going to leave the water column. It is gone. Goodbye, all you toxic compounds. Have fun. But you guys should see an issue here. If this is allowed to run its course naturally, everything leaves. And it's the nitrogen cycle, not the nitrogen linear equation. If we have this rise and fall of all these elements and bacteria working hand in hand, and then eventually the gas just leaves the system, we have a severance here. So nature, she knows what she's doing, installed a protection policy in place. Along with this nitrogen gas that's released, the other byproduct is not only nitrogen gas, but ammonia. And this is the key in nature and how it's done a great job over the years, making sure this is replicated. But if we have nitrogen gas, which leaves completely, so we've taken every compound, made it less toxic, and then got it out of the water column, as a byproduct of that, it's kind of like, it's like seeing again, we'll use a Marvel reference, the little snippet at the very end of the credits. As a little snippet at the very end, we're leaving off some ammonia. So a lot of the nitrogen gas just leaves. We've converted this toxic compound and got it out of the water column. And then just a little snippet of the bad guy in the next movie, we have ammonia as a byproduct. It keeps this entire cycle running. This goes right here, and it starts the entire nitrogen cycle process back over again. It ensures that no matter what, even if, let's say we have a lake that's filled with, let's use salmon, for example. You know, they spawn in freshwater, then go out to sea and come back. Let's say we have thousands of salmon in this freshwater environment, and they all immediately leave to go out to sea. We just went from having a ton of ammonia to basically no ammonia at all. The nitrogen cycle would shut down. But because here at the very last process, we have nitrogen gas and ammonia, it gives us this like glimmer of hope that no matter what, the process is always going to start itself over. A cool little caveat added by nature to ensure that the nitrogen cycle will always run and always be efficient because of that little trace element of ammonia being left behind as an end result to ensure that it, again, kind of moves itself back here and starts the whole process over again. Also mentioned were again, live plants, and algae is one of them. It's probably the least coveted by aquaria keeper because it looks like you haven't taken care of your tank. If algae is growing, you have taken care of your tank. You're taking care of it right in front of us. Algae allows the nitrates to be filtered as well. This is kind of the fallback to combat those anaerobic conditions, because algae and live plants are going to do the work of an anaerobic environment, and they're going to be helping every step of the way. They're basically, again, we'll stick with my weird analogy I've come up with of the Avenger movies. They're like the one guy who shoots the bow and arrow, like, yeah, we don't really need you, but we're glad you're on all our adventures. You do something every now and then. You're not necessarily a superhero, but you're always chipping in. That's basically algae's use here, and live plants in general. They're helping every step of the way. They can't win the whole war on their own. And the other part is, of course, just like the bow and arrow guy, we don't necessarily want them in every movie. We don't want a ton of algae all over the aquarium. Yes, you can tell your boss, hey, I'm running the nitrogen cycle here, and then they'll say, guests can't see, clean that up. So again, counterintuitive, but relevant to how we keep aquaria. Most of the time, what we wind up doing is so step 4 in nature is anaerobic conditions. Step 4 for what we have to do is water changes. Just like the trace elements we were taking out and then replacing, equalizing the balance of things. We do the same thing here. Water changes allow us to combat that nitrate level and keep it at a constant. So step 4 in nature, anaerobic conditions, tons of algae, tons of bacterial growth, no oxygen present, tons of bacterial growth in those environments that difficult to replicate. And in captivity, we've just learned to do water changes. That's our way to combat that. As was mentioned earlier when we were asked for questions, there's a mystery, an aura of intrigue around how to do a water change. I feel like a lot of people just say, oh, I have to do a water change every month, which is fantastic. I'm certainly not discouraging that. But I feel like so many people out there don't understand what a water change is for. You just think it's so it doesn't smell or to get, maybe your tank's gotten dirty. That's not what a water change is for. A, we're helping the nitrogen cycle, and B, there's a very easy way to figure out what you need to do for a water change so that you're doing it correctly. And again, it's completely different than topping off. Topping off's adding to everything we've built up in this tank already. So and again, you can test all 3 stages, ammonia, nitrite, or nitrate. But really, we're looking at the ammonia levels on how to equalize the fact that we don't have that anaerobic environment. We're trying to fix the end of the nitrogen cycle, and we do that through water changes. Now, one of the things to remember, and this is the key part for how to do a water change, is, let me get to the equation portion. Here's what we're looking at. We're looking at the starting concentration of ammonia by the desired, minus the desired concentration of ammonia, obviously over the starting concentration. You don't have to do this last step if you understand how decimal points work, but multiply it by 100, that's your percent water change. The only part you have to remember is that your desired concentration of ammonia should never be 0. You can't have it be 0, right? You know that resets the entire nitrogen cycle. And you know what? Again, I know it's zoo, not math class, but if this is 0, this always winds up being 100% water change, because that's how this equation works out. So it can never be 0 here. Otherwise, every time you add up all this math and do it all on a calculator or in your head, you wind up with a 100% water change. You know that's not the right thing to do. And again, this isn't a knock on, like, here, I'll just use myself for personal experience. It's not a knock on how you may have done things. When I was a kid, I remember my dad used to scoop our betta fish out of the bowl in a net, hold the net in one hand over the half the sink, dump the entire tank out, fill it up with water, dump the betta fish back in. Like, obviously, my untrained zoo mind at the time was like, good idea. Now I'd be like, hey, let's check the pH and only do a 58% bowl change on this fish that was dangling midair over the garbage disposal. But he made it for years. It worked. I'm just teaching you the right way to do it now. So don't worry about your past indiscretions. We're just moving forward and being better from here. So let me clear all this off again. Very easy calculations happen. Just always keep in the back of your mind, 0.1's a great place to be. This is what you want to do your water change at. In this scenario that plays out, we're at about a 58% water change, but never, ever, ever have this be zero. Because again, picture this. If we just do 100% water change, there's nothing left here. And then we have to start this whole process back over again. So brings us to some interesting talking points. And again, I really don't want to sound like I'm picking on the pet stores here. Again, this video link will be posted for you along with this lecture. The initial startup, and we've already heard some great ideas from conversations earlier of hardy fish, hot dogs being introduced, things like that. And it's ironic because I saw online not too long ago, somebody went out and bought a fish tank and they shared a picture of it. And they said, oh, it's too bad I have to wait a couple weeks to get fish. And I was like, wow, I can't remember the last time I've seen someone actually go home and cycle their tank. This is where, again, the idea of the hot dogs or the hardier fish come into play. Because so often I've seen people go take their tank home, put water in it, plug in the filter, and then just leave it. And they think because they're cycling the water somehow, it's getting safe for fish. Going home and cycling your tank doesn't work. You need to start the nitrogen cycle. That's what they and again, not picking on pet stores, but that I feel like that's just so, it goes unmentioned far too often. Just go home and fill it up and plug it in and start cycling it. That is doing nothing. Until you add ammonia and get the nitrogen cycle going, you've accomplished nothing. You've just taken 2 weeks off the life of your filter. That's about it. You need to get ammonia started. And one of the things that you'll see a lot, and this is the one time I will say this is incorrect by pet stores, are these instant add fish immediately, biological enhancers. First off, let's think for a second. We know we need to add ammonia, right? We know that there needs to be this rise and fall of bacteria. Look at these bottles. They're completely sealed. Think that makes an anaerobic environment? Yes. Do you think that all the bacteria you're supposed to be adding is already dead? Yes. So adding these, not only is it not safe now to add fish, you've just created a giant nitrogen spike because all you've dumped in is a bottle of dead bacteria. It's an anaerobic environment, guys. Think about it. There's no way that all this bacteria is sitting there doing really well for itself and thriving. First off, it has no ammonia to consume. Second off, it needs oxygen. So all you've done is create a giant nitrogen spike. I'll say this. If you add this instead of the hot dog, then it's relevant because you have created a huge nitrogen spike. That will get the ball rolling. But to think that you can take a closed bottle of living bacteria that's supposed to be competing in this whole cycle and that it's all thriving in there, that's grossly misleading. That is not how you start and cycle a tank. And cycling a tank is a process. It needs to go through the cycling process. And again, I know we've all been there. I know we've all seen it. It's happened. That's okay. I'm teaching you the right way to do it. Can you go to the store and buy a 20-gallon tank and throw a goldfish in it and it'll be fine? Yeah, more than likely. Um, I'd say dechlorinated water is about the only requirement that goldfish need. Um, yeah, I mean, there's hardy species out there, guys. We're talking about proper aquaria keeping. Will animals survive some of this process? Sure. But let's all kind of step our game up to the next level and make sure our animals aren't just surviving in an environment, but thriving. That's what we're shooting for here. So, with this entire process, it truly is time consuming, and I just can't stress enough the importance of the process. Like, does anybody want to speak to the importance of it? Maybe some experience with it. The importance, though, of this whole process getting set up.
Yeah, so one of the things, yeah, like through my childhood experience, we had a beta, and my mom would just stick him in a cup of water and scrub it off everything and just give him a full water change. So when I first got into fish keeping and like just what do I need to do to start a fish tank and seeing the process, you do see a lot of people that say like add old filter media or get the pantyhose from your local fish store, and oh, if I throw an old tank filter in there, I know it'll only take me 3 days before I can add fish. And it's all crap. Like you have to test every day and you have to watch your full cycle. And yeah, you might cut 3 days off of it, adding some extra like filter media, but it's not worth it. Like I just saw someone post on Facebook that they lost $300 worth of fish because their local fish store sold them a tank, literally a tank and fish in the same day. And it doesn't work that way. And it's not worth it. Like not only is it money and animals' lives, but like you're just going to end up frustrated and not even want to continue with the hobby. Like it's better to just wait the 3 weeks and be patient and just test every day. Make sure you understand. It also gives you a chance to understand the cycle and really, really see what's going on and see where your levels should be rather than just, hey, I bought a fish tank, I killed a bunch of fish, and now I'm selling it because I'm sad.
Those are I really think that hopefully that was relatable. I think everybody's been through that exact scenario. I love the example of going to the pet store and buying the tank and the fish at the same time. Like, and again, guys, I'm not picking on pet stores. I get it. It's a business, but the idea that you could sit there and be like, "Hey, here's your fish tank. Yeah, go home and just fill it up with water straight from your tap and dump your fish in. They'll be fine." Um, yeah, sometimes they survive, but let's better ourselves as keepers. That's not the example you want to lead with. Um, and as was brought up, the testing the whole process and understanding the cycle, I think that honestly is just as important as getting your water quality parameters correct to begin with. Is understanding what you're measuring. You're not just taking measurements. Here, I'll put it this way, because this is one thing that I always remind my students of. Uh, you guys can do all the tests and all the logs you want. If you do your daily tests, awesome. Let's say you're working with mammals now. If every day I say this animal's alive and it ate, awesome. Until you compare those notes back to each other and you're watching the whole cycle unfold, taking daily measurements and notes doesn't matter. Like, good for you. You've checked your boxes, you took your notes. Unless you're comparing that and extrapolating that out over all the data you've accumulated, you're not gleaning anything from that information. It really comes down to, hey, my ammonia's here, my nitrates are non-existent. I'll add some more substrate. Oh, now my nitrite levels are present. That means I know I've got my nitrobacter. My nitrous ammonius are here. Everybody's come to the party. All these levels are rising and falling as they should. You've also got to figure by the time you do add your fish, assuming you've gone through the cycling process, even though you've got this kind of micro starting cycle, the second I dump in 10 Oscars, all of a sudden I'm going to get huge spikes in everything. So I've got to make sure I'm ready to combat that. So adding fish slowly, one at a time or two at a time, very important. We don't want to go from a perfectly cycled tank to dumping in 10 gigantic, and if you've ever seen an Oscar eat, they're like bears digging through a trash can. It's dirty and horrifying and disgusting. I don't want to go from a perfectly cycled tank to dumping in basically the equivalent of like a nuclear waste container in there and assume that it's going to still stay on pace. This is where terms like a bioload come in. Bioload is anything that's a waste-producing organism. In the case of things like goldfish, Oscars, a lot of your messier fish, aquatic turtles are a great example too. If we want to get out of just the fish realm, aquatic turtles are very, very dirty, notoriously. We know that we're going to have a very waste-producing organism, and we know we're going to have. I'm so glad pantyhose got brought up because it is a great usage. You can fill it with things like ceramic noodles, extra substrate. It can be in your filter. It's a site for bacteria to grow. But unless you know why you're using it, you're still at a disservice. You're at a disadvantage against natural processes that are going to occur in your tank. As we wrap this up, again, the bioload produced by introduced fish is going to spike everything again. And you may have to adjust what you have in your tank, whether it's decor, whether it's stuff in your filter. Again, ceramic noodles, filter floss, things like that are all going to come into play here as you add and subtract things to curtail this ammonia spike. With the ammonia spike itself, again, this is why we're adding fish slowly over time, because we need time for everything to catch up. You don't just add a ton of ammonia and all of a sudden the bacteria spikes as well. We need, again, surface area for it to accumulate, build, combat, and then it too will die off, creating not only let's say we go from ammonia to nitrites. Not only have we consumed, converted, and released a less toxic compound, but as the bacteria itself die, they're creating ammonia when they die as well. So there's a constant ebb and flow here that needs to be taken into account and consideration. And again, this is why a bigger environment is going to be easier to treat, because we're not going to see, let's say we go to a 20-gallon tank versus a tank at the Georgia Aquarium. If I drop a goldfish into the 20-gallon tank, huge ammonia spike. Drop a goldfish into the million-gallon aquarium, literally not even a blip on the radar. The more water we have, the more wiggle room we have to combat this. We also have more sites for bacterial growth and different superheroes to step up to every occasion. With nitrite spikes, again, we talked about what a nitrite spike looks like, the almost gasping for air appearance at the water surface, a good sign. But again, I just hope, I know I've drawn it 100 times. I hope you keep this in mind of how each of these grow and rise and fall with one another. We can't ever start at just one point and assume it's good. Adding a ton of ammonia, if this little nitrosomonas is still down here, all we've done is compromise our tank immensely. We need time for this to catch up and rise to the occasion. Yeah, it really is a give and take scenario here. And every step of the way, as was mentioned earlier, with the testing, test every cycle of this, every level. High ammonia tells us nothing. It just tells us that our tank is toxic. If I've got high ammonia, high nitrites, and high nitrates, I know that everything's there. Everybody's come to the party, if you will. Now I've got relevant information. Just knowing my tank has ammonia tells me, A, I need to do a water change, but B, nothing much. It just tells me step one of the whole process. Again, as far as the final product, for the most part, and we had people chiming in on this as well, the anaerobic environment isn't impossible by any means, but to your average aquarist, really difficult to manage. And nitrates is going to be kind of where we end. We don't get to end on nitrogen gas usually. Live plants can help, certainly algal growth. And again, if you have a complicated enough setup and you can get to an anaerobic environment, then you really could reduce your water changes to none, with the exception of evaporation and needing to top off and replace those trace elements and balance that out. That doesn't always happen and very rarely does, which is why, again, we've developed the art of aquaria keeping and water changes, the equation I showed you, all that. All of this takes place, which again, I know we focused this whole day on the kind of chemistry of it all, but all of this is how we treat and manage the husbandry of aquatic animals. That aqueous environment is what we're treating to ensure our animals have the best life available to them. So that wraps up the nitrogen cycle. Again, go back through, make sure you're very familiar with it. I assure you, anywhere you go to work, whether computers run it or not, or whether you're using monitors every day and doing your own testing, this is the most integral part of managing captive aqueous animals. Gonna, again, minimize stress and provide them the best life possible. So that concludes our nitrogen cycle. And yeah, again, I know everybody wants to get into the husbandry of them and learn about the animals themselves. This is the husbandry. This is how we care for animals that live within an aqueous system.